just again, I appreciate everyone for joining us here. My name is Langston Clark, and I am the founder of Entrepreneurial Appetite, a series of events dedicated to building community, promoting intellectualism, and supporting Black businesses. And today, we will be supporting my alma mater, North Carolina. I'm gonna use the whole name, how we do it, like how they do a freshman orientation. North Carolina.
The illustrious.
Oh, they didn't do that when I was in school. Y'all younger than me. So the illustrious North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. And Adam, when you introduce Alabama A&M, you can give his whole name too. Give the government name. And the reason why I have Dr. Morton, future Dr. Patrick, and Courtney Dabney here today is because when I think about supporting Black businesses and Black entrepreneurs, I have a very sort of broad definition of that. And what I mean by that is I'm thinking about Black institutions that support our communities economically, spiritually, the whole nine, okay? And so I have the honor of just presenting these folks to you here today, because if it wasn't for them, we would not be, as Entrepreneurial Appetite, partnering with North Carolina A&T to support an endowment that Brittany, Terrell, and I have started called From A&T to PhD. And so for those of you who purchase tickets tonight, 10% of whatever Entrepreneurial Appetite makes tonight is gonna go to help support that endowment. And so I just wanna ask Brittany and Terrell to just start off and really just briefly talk about your experience at North Carolina A&T and why it was important for you to be a part of starting this endowment.
Hi all, nice to be with everyone this evening. My name is Brittany Patrick. I am excuse the baby in the background, but I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Maryland, College Park, and a 2010 graduate of North Carolina A&T. I'm truly Aggie born and Aggie bred, as he's saying Aggie pride, as Dr. Morton is as well. My parents met at A&T. A&T was the primary college, or one college I applied to. I did half my application for another university that shall remain nameless, because I had my mind made up, and there's not a day that goes by that I don't value the experiences and the opportunities that A&T has provided me to pursue excellence in every area of my life. And I absolutely know that that's not an experience that I could have received at any other university. And so I'm honored that Dr. Morton, Dr. Clark and I have been able to establish this endowment From A&T to PhD, which truly represents our values, our professional experience, but more than anything, our love for our dear old A&T.
And I don't know how I will be able to follow up with such an amazing introduction from the illustrious future Dr. Brittany Patrick, as well as that future Aggie that she is taking care of in the background at the current moment. But my name is Terrell Morton. I'm currently an assistant professor of identity and justice, identity and justice in STEM education at the University of Missouri, Columbia. I'm a 2011 graduate of the illustrious North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. And as future Dr. Patrick said, I am also Aggie born and Aggie bred. My parents met at A&T. They had me while they were still attending A&T. And I actually went to college classes before I went to daycare. So I had the opportunity to really get a strong hold on what Aggie pride meant. And then taking that to the next level, went there for my alma mater and continue to find ways to pour into the space that poured into me. And so that was part of the reasoning for why I was excited to not only connect with my friends and fellow Aggies, but to do so in a way that was investing back into spaces that invested in us in different capacities across our own personal, social, emotional, psychological, and professional journeys.
Look, he talked like a PhD too. Lord have mercy. Anyways, I want to spotlight right now a very special person, Miss Courtney Dabney, who really has been like the catalyst for us to bring this together. We have been talking to Courtney probably for like 3 years. Like when you think about it, it's been like 3-4 years. to get this thing going. And so, Courtney, I really, if you could just kind of like tell us, for anyone who's in the audience today, anyone who's listening, what they can do from your perspective as someone who works in development at a historically Black college to build relationships with someone like you for the most effective way that they can give back to their institution.
Certainly. Thank you all for allowing me to be a part of this webinar this evening. Again, I'm Courtney Dabney. I serve as the Director of Development for the John R. and Kathy R. Harrison College of Health and Human Sciences at A&T. And it is such a pleasure to be here. I think that there are many ways that alums can give back. Certainly, scholarship, private philanthropy makes that margin of excellence. It creates and allows us to do more for our students, for our faculty, build new opportunities, buildings. All of those things come into play when you're talking about private philanthropy. But certainly we don't just need your treasure, we need your time. We need you to give back to our students through mentorship. So there are many ways that you can get involved with our students on campus and with our faculty. And so I encourage, if you are interested in learning more about ways that you can get involved with the university, certainly reach out to me. I'm always looking for creative ways to involve folks. It doesn't have to be, how we think that philanthropy should be. We are open to creating new, innovative ways to give back to our students so that they can be exactly where you all are today. We know that A&T builds such a strong foundation for students. And so we want to make sure that we continue to provide that legacy. I did not know that both of you all, Brittany and Terrell, that both of your parents met at A&T. How awesome is that? I think that just shows the type of what A&T does and how it creates that legacy and how we continue to build. And so I'm just excited to be here and certainly open to have discussions about ways that folks can get involved with what's going on at the university currently. And I can drop my information in the chat if someone would like to reach out.
Yes, please. Yes, please. So again, thank all of you in the audience here for joining us today. I actually think Terrell and Brittany, and this is how I know Courtney is like the #1 development person at A&T. She got Brittany's name right, and we've been slaughtering that thing for years, okay? It's Brittany, okay, Dr. Brittany Patrick, and Terrell's parents both met at North Carolina A&T, and I want to introduce you all today to our feature speaker, who is Adam Harris, who writes like he got a PhD in history. He is a graduate of Alabama A&M State University, and I want to have him take the time to introduce who he is to you all so that you all can get to know our feature speaker here for today.
Thank you so much. As Langston mentioned, I'm Adam Harris, the author of The State Must Provide, Why America's Colleges Have Always Been Unequal and How to Set Them Right, as well as a staff writer at The Atlantic. But first and foremost, I am an alum of Alabama A&M University in Normal, Alabama, Alabama's largest public HBCU. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It is always fantastic to be joined by folks in the HBCU community. North Carolina A&T, third largest research producing institution in the state of North Carolina, just behind UNC and North Carolina State. So A&T is a fantastic example of what our institutions have been able to do, in spite of a legacy of underfunding, right? That these institutions have been able to perform above and beyond. It's just really a testament to the faculty, the students, and all of the folks involved. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. So Adam, I know you went to Alabama A&M. You have a trader in your household. You mentioned it before we got started. So can you just give us some context of your family history, your family legacy at historically Black colleges and universities?
Yeah, absolutely. So HBCUs are really the institutions that educated my family. As you mentioned, my dad is the only one who, and I believe he's on the chat today and the webinar today. But he attended Alabama State. My mom attended Alabama A&M in Oakwood. My oldest sister attended Hampton. My other sister attended Alabama A&M as well. And so, my uncle attended Alabama A&M, was a drum major. So these are really, family institutions. And when you talk about the legacy of HBCUs, right, Brittany's parents meeting there, Terrell's parents meeting there, like that, these are really legacy institutions. And they're really the institutions that help to build, a Black middle class. Even today, as HBCUs only represent about 3% of the, four-year nonprofit institutions, nonprofit institutions in the country, they still make up about 25% of Black STEM graduates, 50% of Black lawyers and doctors, 80% of Black judges. And on top of all of that, like they're doing the work of educating 60%, like 60% of HBCU student bodies are low-income students. So people who are eligible for federal Pell Grants. So, they're still doing that sort of yeoman's work that they have historically done. And, that the sort of legacy that they are providing, that foundation that they provide for the Black community and Black families is hard to understate.
So I also want to just ask you, share a little bit about like, what was your experience as a student at Alabama A&M, or maybe even like, what was it like going, and I don't know if you did or you didn't, did you go to homecoming at Alabama State? And like, what was that like to maybe go to Alabama State homecoming with your dad, but then have to go to an Alabama A&M homecoming as well? Like, before you went to Alabama, who did you root for before you went to Alabama A&M?
So a mix of places. So we were a military family, so we were a little bit all over. But one of the things, we lived in Montgomery, and so we would go to, we went to Alabama State's homecoming. My cousin was actually in the band at Alabama State, as was my other uncle. He was in the band at Alabama State, and that experience of seeing the homecomings at Alabama State, seeing the homecomings at Alabama A&M, being enmeshed in the Black college culture, going to the Magic City Classic before even enrolling at an HBCU, it just really kind of showed me the sort of energy around the institutions. A lot of people aren't, they may not be exposed to the institutions, but you really see the energy around those schools. And then when I enrolled at A&M, right, I think I write in the book about how before it was sort of my home by proxy. And once I enrolled there, it really felt like my home. I was able to find a community of folks who pushed me and challenged me. I was in the political science department, so under the umbrella of the Department of Behavioral Sciences. And so, there were professors there, from Dr. Ronald Slaughter to Miss Stephanie Allen, who was taught my African American history course, to Miss Diane Wilkinson, who taught all my philosophy courses, Dr. Emmanuel Obuo, who taught African politics and Blacks in politics, that really nurtured me as a person. They weren't trying to say that you have to perform your Blackness in any sort of way, don't have to do any sort of extra thing. I could just sort of be myself and learn and explore all of these different ideas. And I think that was a really enriching opportunity to be able to be in that environment, to be around folks, from my classmates, Wakita Tobar, who's now working as a lawyer in Philadelphia, to Kevin Ferguson, to Adio Totola, and just being around these classmates and a community of folks who pushed you and challenged you, but then also had a good time, right? Who knew how to have a good time and enjoy themselves. It was just an incredible experience, and I would hope that anyone who was attending college now would be able to have a similar experience like that, because it really was. If you haven't had the HBCU experience, you haven't, it's a very singular experience.
It is very much so. Very, very much so. And I sometimes get mad because, like, I don't want to say I get mad. I get a little bothered because I went to A&T for undergrad. I went to Ohio State for my master's, and I went to Texas for my doctorate. And every now and then, like, a student from UT that was an undergrad while I was in grad school will say, "I thank God UT Austin gave me an HBCU experience." And I was like, what? No, they just don't know. There's no reproduction of that at a PWI, an HSI, a tribal college, whatever. It's not the same. It's not the same.
It's fundamentally different. And I think the PWI experience as a Black student at a PWI, it is a different experience. Of course, you will have your community of folks. I went out to Texas Tech after Alabama A&M, and there was a really strong Black community there. But it was a different experience than an HBCU experience, because when you're there, there were different things, like the fact that Texas Tech wanted to be a R1 institution. It was one of the few institutions that wanted to be an R1 that did not have an Africana Studies program. It was a place where there were Black students made up about 4 or 5% of the student body there. And so, yes, it's a engaged and active community that you're involved in, but it's not, if you look at a place like Langston University in Oklahoma, right? Small institution, fewer than 2,000 students, has about 1,450 Black students who attend Langston University. The University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University combined only have about 200 more Black students than Langston University itself. So just thinking about the amount, like the vastness of the amount of Black people on those campuses, and in addition to kind of how they're able to interact with each other, is it's a different experience, a singular experience.
That's right. I think about my experience, and in a lot of ways, as a student, I got accelerated because the faculty members who were teaching the classes were my advisor, so I had to go see them. The classes were smaller, the culture was different. I could call like 5 professors from undergrad right now on the phone.
Yes.
And so I don't think that is a similar experience that people get at other institutions, just based upon the history, the culture, and the internal policies and structures of those institutions. So you mentioned a few of your professors that you had. Can you talk to me about how those relationships have endured and how those relationships have helped you to get to the point where you're a staff writer for The Atlantic, and then you're writing this wonderful book, The State Must Provide?
Yeah, I remember very vividly. This was January 2011. I was working in the Department of Behavioral Sciences. I was a student assistant, and I remember we were having a lot of conversations about, okay, what is everybody doing this summer? And because there are all of these programs, from pre-law programs to summer undergraduate research fellowships to all of these different things that the department had cultivated and created a crop of things for students to apply to. And I was really interested in the time in voting ethics, and sort of the ethics of voting, and because there had been a couple of big university professors who were like, well, maybe it's not appropriate. Like, maybe people shouldn't always vote. And it struck me as something that was fundamentally flawed. And I was really interested in studying that. And so my professor, Miss Wilkinson at A&M, really pushed me to apply to the summer undergraduate research fellowship at UC Irvine. And that experience that summer sort of set me on a trajectory. And I would have never known about this program. I would have never applied to this program if not for, the faculty urging me along. And then, I wouldn't have been accepted into that program if not for Dr. Obua, who actually engaged his students in doing research projects and had us go down to a research conference at Samford University to present our research. And we were the only undergraduate students. There were 4 of us. I think it was me, Amanda Watley, and 2 others who went down and presented our research projects at this conference for graduate students. And this was when we were in undergrad. And so to have that experience and that foundation of professors who were always trying to push you to do the next thing, to go to the next level, and were really sort of nurturing, and that was a special experience. And then even now, when I finished the book and I was thinking of all of the people who helped me get to that point where I was actively writing a book, I reached out to Professor Allen, who I really credit with the books that she had us read during her African American history course. Really made history engaging in a new way to me. And it also, she would talk about the ways that our proximity to the past and our proximity to this history is actually not that far. It's like, it's a very close, it's a tangible thing. If you talk to your grandparents, if you're still able to talk to your grandparents, right? I write in the book about Section 256 in Alabama, the law that segregated public education in Alabama. And that was passed in 1901. And so that's when my grandparents' parents were alive. They were alive when Alabama passed that law. And so just really making that history real and tangible, and the fact that they were sort of attaching that proximity, that physical piece to it. I think that comes out in my writing as I try to write and make it tangible, make it something that people can feel, to make that proximity feel more immediate. And I really credit my professors at A&M for giving me that grounding.
Yeah, I would add that the proximity to history is something interesting that you bring up, because I think there's history that all students get when they attend an HBCU specific to that institution, that you don't get in your mainstream textbooks, right? Yeah. I didn't know about the sit-in movements until I got to A&T. Like, I didn't know, right? And so as you're a student at Alabama A&M, like, your proximity, you're right there.
Yes.
Like, you're in it. You know what I mean? The dorm is named after some civil rights activist. You know what I mean? The other dorm is named after some president who was negotiating between the state and Black people's freedom and had to be conservative in some areas and not so conservative in other areas, just to make sure that the institution stayed afloat.
Exactly.
And so what I appreciate about the book is that the book provided a lot more context for the policies that were going on at the time that made it difficult for HBCUs to be able to get what they needed to provide for the students. So I'm wondering, can you give us a little bit of the history of the policies that have allowed for the inequities to happen in the past and persist even until today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, going back to the sort of foundation and establishment of the state university systems as we sort of recognize them today, it really starts with the passage of the Morrill Act in 1862. It sent these institutions to sort of far-flung places that were, previously remote. So Ames, Iowa now has Iowa State University, and Auburn now has Auburn University. Basically what that policy was they gave states land expropriated from Native Americans that could be sold in order to fund an institution. It's how you get Penn State, Michigan State. Cornell is a land grant institution. But these institutions were not available for Black students. And only a few states actually created HBCUs in order to fill that void at the time. So for instance, Alcorn State was one of the original Black land grants founded in 1871. But the quirk there is that by 1871, they were given a guaranteed appropriation, $50,000 a year for at least a decade. 1875 comes around, the so-called Redeemers move back into public office in the state towards the end of the short Reconstruction in Mississippi. And they reduced that appropriation to $15,000 a year. A year later, 1876, they reduced the appropriation again to $5,500. Meanwhile, the University of Mississippi's faculty is saying, we would rather close than enroll a Black student. And so you start to see the beginnings of that funding divide and that funding gap for students. And then you fast forward to 1890. And I think that's when people really start to, a lot of HBCUs call themselves 1890 institutions. Of course, when North Carolina A&T is an 1890, Alabama A&M is an 1890 as a land grant. But that 1890 bill was really to give predominantly white institutions more money. They said that we're doing a great job in doing what we were supposed to do, educating white men, training white men, but we need more money in order to increase our capacity. And so the federal government ultimately ends up putting in a little quirk in the bill to say, okay, you can get this extra money, but you can't discriminate against Black students. You at least need to have a separate college for them. And they say you can be a college or an institute. And ultimately that's how, states end up funding Black colleges, because most states would have rather, spent money to fund another college rather than, integrating their institutions. And those that did, Iowa State University, they were one of the first states to accept that land grant, and they didn't enroll their first Black student until 1890. So you really start to see from that makes really the biggest injection of funds into higher education that the nation has ever seen, bigger than the GI Bill, if you're kind of rating it with today's dollars. That was the largest injection of funding in higher education, and Black students were shut out of it. Wow. And so it's really the development from there of how, the federal government and state governments have really sustained, maintained, and defended that, is really sort of the examination from that point is what the book is hinging on.
Yeah, so one of the things that, I don't know, I got into my feelings reading the book, because what you lay out is chess, right? It's like the state's white supremacist system structures, like however we want to say it, racism is playing chess with justice, or playing chess with us, right? So, okay, we'll give you this, but we're not really going to give you this. Yeah. You're going to get this, but you're not really going to get this. You're going to get this, but you're not going to get this. And so along the whole way, it's just, they're trying to make it seem like they're doing something right, but they're really not doing the right thing. And I think what's beautiful about that is that HBCUs, many of them were birthed out of somebody else trying to do the wrong thing, but yet and still the things that they have done for us are amazing. So can you just tell us a little bit about how like the chess moves that were played to ensure that Black colleges up until now don't have the same type of funding as predominantly white institutions?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I learned, in digging through newspaper archives, digging through old, legislative budgets for the book, there were all of these inflection points where things could have been different, where they could have funded HBCUs, where they actually did studies about, what it would take to actually properly fund their institution. So the one that I typically mention, because it's one of the more egregious ones. So Kentucky in the early 1900s brings down this sort of master teacher from Hampton, William T.B. Williams, who taught at Hampton, he taught at Tuskegee, and they say, study our Black college, tell us what we need to raise it up to be like Tuskegee. And he comes down, he looks at the campus, and he gives them this really brutal report. He's like, your girls' dorm, it's fire prone and doesn't have any fire escapes. Your boys' dorm's in a mud puddle. Your electrical plant doesn't have any power. The buildings are old. The faculty is underpaid. The students are fantastic. The faculty is fantastic. The learning that is going on here is great. But, it's going to take a lot to ensure that this institution is not a liability in terms of like actually people, risking their lives in old buildings in places where, there might be a fire. And the state is like, well, we will spare no expense, but we only have $40,000 for this project. And so you can fix everything with that. And, a way that I like to explain it is like, if they had done what they were supposed to do then, it's like buying a toothbrush. Say it's $3.50 to buy, a pack of toothbrushes, and that's, you can do your routine maintenance. But if you don't have the money to buy that toothbrush, then it's going to turn into a cavity, and then you have to go and get your filling. But if you don't have the money to go get a filling, you don't have insurance, then it sits for longer and it becomes a root canal, and now you're spending $1,500 rather than $3.50. And so it's sort of the way that inequity works is that it's sort of built. And each time, I think it was fascinating, whether that was Ada Lewis Sipple Fisher saying that I wish that it had rained when this lawmaker came to our campus, because he would have seen the way that our infrastructure is broken. Or, Black students in Mississippi saying that, there's this sort of there's a soggy state of campus. Our green spaces don't drain right. And so they're putting money in this Ayers settlement in the 2000s to refurbish the infrastructure of the campus because of all of that deferred maintenance over time. And I think, the the lie that state legislators have liked to tell themselves is that, oh, well, it's just going to take this year's appropriation and that's going to fix it. But that's not how deferred maintenance works. It's like, okay, yes, that can pay for this, but then you still have all of the day-to-day things that the institutions need to pay for. And, we can talk about this a little bit later, but when we see these sort of settlements nowadays, right, where Maryland recently settled with its Black colleges, $577 million over 10 years between the 4 colleges, that seems like a lot of money. And it seems, but, and they brought in an expert who said they would be owed at least $2.73 billion. That was sort of the minimum that the institutions would need. We've already seen what $500 million split up several ways over a series of years does for institutions, because Mississippi, that's exactly what they did in 2002. And the state hasn't even lived up to its settlement. It was supposed to create a $35 million endowment for the Black colleges there, and they've only raised $1 million to this point. So even like at a very granular level, the states aren't doing what they're supposed to do, even according to these settlements. But that really shows how that sort of inequity has, that started at the beginning has just continued on because states haven't been willing to do the work or provide the funding to actually address them.
So I think even myself as a graduate, it's important that I be reminded of why there are gaps between what our schools have and what other schools have. Sometimes, like, people will say, well, there's leadership issues, or it's the students, or how they do with Black colleges. There's always that, but context and history matters. Like, that $2.7 billion matters. So I got, this is kind of like a pivot tangential question. One thing that that kind of irked me, because I'm not from North Carolina. So y'all that are in the chat and all that stuff that from North Carolina, don't get on me. But I never understood, and I want to know if this is at Alabama A&M. I never understood why. Well, I get it, but it bothered me that students at A&T will wear Duke stuff or Chapel Hill paraphernalia. But you go to A&T, and those schools, they won't even let us in, right? But there's a part of us that loves to still be attached to those predominantly white institutions, many of which were built by slaves, but we wear their stuff. They won't let us in there. If you go on campus, like, microaggressions, macroaggressions. So what was it? Did you have experiences like that at Alabama A&M? And if so, how do we shift the culture so that our students are more aware of the implications of them representing, maybe in some ways, the institutions that have benefited from us not getting what we deserve?
Yeah, and I think a lot of there were experiences like that at A&M, and I think a lot of that hinges on sports culture, in all honesty, right? And it's like there's this sort of cognitive dissonance happening where you can kind of know that your institution, that other institutions have this sort of legacy, like this legacy of discrimination, but still, be a fan of their sports team, like, right? So in the 1980s, when Bo Jackson won the Heisman, literally on the same day that he won the Heisman, a federal judge says that Auburn is the most segregated institution in the state. And so while people are praising Bo Jackson, praising the university for having Bo Jackson, they are also enrolling about 2% Black students. You fast forward to 2002, they're enrolling about 5% Black students. And now at Auburn University, there are fewer Black students on campus at Auburn University than there were in 2002 when they had 4 or 5% Black students. And so it's interesting, and I think the more there's been over the last couple of years, you've seen prominent high school recruits giving a serious look to HBCUs. Some of them actually attending HBCUs. North Carolina A&T has a fantastic track program that really now you have J.R. Smith, who's going to be on the golf team there. Steph Curry's done a lot of stuff for Howard in terms of their golf program there. I think that the more, if you sort of have that shift in college sports, because a lot of people's allegiances to colleges is actually more based in the college sports culture than it is in you know, the actual attendance culture. But the more you have these institutions in their full capacity, like they're it's like not just thinking of it as, oh, you know, it's an HBCU, it's sort of like this parochial offshoot of higher education, but actually think of it as central to like the rest of higher education. Like this is a significant part of the higher education ecosystem, on par with, you know, Alabama, on par with Auburn, on par with, you know, UNC or wherever it might be. Then you start to see a shift in the culture of, you know, people saying, oh, actually, you know, I want this Norfolk State shirt, or, you know, I'm at Norfolk State, I want this Virginia State shirt, or, you know, maybe, you know, buy some Alabama A&M stuff. And, you know, and I think that the more that, you know, HBCUs are having, we often have this conversation about HBCUs having a renaissance. Yeah. And one of the renaissances that they actually are having is a renaissance of attention, where people are paying attention to the institutions. You know, you are now seeing HBCUs. When I was first started covering HBCUs, you know, there was, you know, HBCU Digest. There was, you know, sort of the HBCU sports sites, but major outlets were not interested in covering HBCUs outside of something bad happening. And so what you were saying now is people really taking a second look and saying, oh, the vice president came from an HBCU. Oh, the lieutenant governor of Wisconsin came from an HBCU. Oh, all of these celebrities that I didn't know came from HBCUs. You know, now Chris Paul is wearing the gear to every, you know, just about every game. Let me take a second look and see what's actually going on at these institutions. As you know, people pay more attention, I think that the institutions will have, you know, that sort of renaissance that's necessary.
That's good. I want to get back into some more of the history, because we have some folks from Missouri here. I'm wondering if you could share the part about the book that is related to, I don't know if I want to say the integration or the attempt at integration at Missouri.
Yeah. So that section so it takes up basically an entire chapter. Well, it does take up an entire chapter. It's called The Tragedy of Lloyd Gaines. And Lloyd Gaines is from Water Valley, Mississippi. He moved up to Missouri when he was a teenager with his family, and graduated from high school in Missouri, ultimately ended up going to Harris Stowe College and then transferring over to Lincoln University of Missouri. So he went to both of the state's HBCUs, and he wanted to be a lawyer. You know, it's one of the, as an aside, one of the interesting things about, you know, the people whose names are now attached to these fights is their wants and desires as students are not too different from the wants and desires of students today. And so Lloyd Gaines, he wanted to be a lawyer, and he wanted to be a lawyer in Missouri. So the best way he thought to do that was by attending law school in Missouri. But Missouri didn't have a law school for Black students. They were one of the several states that practiced this scheme of sending Black students out of state. Typically, they would take money from the HBCU's budget to appropriate to sending students out of state so that they could attend graduate school. But he didn't want to do that. He wanted to attend school in the state of Missouri. And so the NAACP, alongside the NAACP, files a lawsuit against the state of Missouri to say that, okay, you guys said that you wanted separate but equal, but you don't even have separate. Like, if you want to have separate but equal, first establish separate. And the Supreme Court ultimately agrees and says, hey, if you want to, you know, if you want to do this, if you want to say Plessy v. Ferguson is what you wanted, then you at least need to have a separate option for Black students. And so Missouri ultimately tries to, you know, go through the motions of setting up a law school at Lincoln University of Missouri. And the real tragedy of Lloyd Gaines' story, because the NAACP and Lloyd Gaines were going to sort of continue the fight, the tragedy of his story is he ultimately goes missing. And you know, when I first read his story, my thought was immediately, oh my God, a mother lost her son, a family lost their brother, they lost, you know, a relative. And you really see in his story the way that these fights affected the people who were fighting them. You know, he writes a letter to his mom, you know, the last letter that he ever sends to her. And, you know, this is after he's coming off a speech where he's talking to students and he's saying, you know, you can take on these fights, you can do whatever you want. and really, meanwhile, it's like weighing on him as well. And he's like, I'm just a man. Like, and sometimes I wish I didn't take on the fight, but now I'm in it. But I'm just a man. And that, I think that we have this tendency to divorce the people involved in it from like the general idea of the fight for equity and the fight for equality. When in reality, the more that we can humanize these people, the more that we can see our own roles in the fights as well. Because these were people who had years of their life. I don't like to use the words gave up, but they had years of their life taken from them because the state would not do what it said it was going to do, provide an equal education. And the title, "The State Must Provide," comes from a subsequent case where the Supreme Court said the state must provide an equal education for her as soon as it does for any other student in accordance to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So it's saying the state must provide that equal education, and they were robbed of that. And so every day that the higher education system is not equitable, this every day that historically Black institutions, which continue to perform this remarkable work, community colleges, which perform this remarkable work, are underfunded. That is robbing people of their constitutional rights in some ways.
Yeah. Can you talk, and you started mentioning it before, can you talk a little bit about the shortcomings of the states in trying to fix some of the damage that had been done in the past?
Yeah, so a lot of states, right? There's still several states that have not proven to the federal government that they desegregated their higher education systems because of how they have treated their Black colleges and Black education. But the states that have, still have lingering issues. So Mississippi, for example, is one of the states that settled with its Black colleges and the people who brought the lawsuit in order to get out of federal monitoring. And it's an incomplete settlement. In the 1980s, North Carolina did the same thing. Right after there was the transition from the Carter administration, when the old Department of Health, Education, and Welfare had been rejecting North Carolina's desegregation plan. As soon as it switched over to the Reagan administration, the Reagan administration said, "Oh no, actually, North Carolina, this looks good." And a former Carter administration official told the New York Times, this looks less like a settlement to help these institutions and more like a joint defense between the US government and the state of North Carolina of everything they've done in the past. And so, you really start to, with these settlements, they were, in a lot of cases, imperfect settlements. And so states have tried to get a bargain in order to sort of absolve themselves of their past issues, of the vestiges of racism and discrimination in their higher education system. Even now, right, when North Carolina A&T made the move to become, a Carnegie designated R1 institution or high research activity producing institution, it wasn't given any money to make that move. Meanwhile, when two predominantly white institutions did so in the state of North Carolina, and this is in the mid-aughts, so this is in this century, when two other predominantly white institutions made that move after North Carolina A&T did, they were given $10 million apiece to make that transition. And so you still see the ways that states are not equalizing funding. In North Carolina A&T, they're working now to get that money back. I think that to this point, they've been able to get 2.5 million, but you think about what the other institutions have been able to build on. Like wealth doesn't stagnate. Wealth, it builds on itself. And so, that's $10 million they could have received in 2004, 2005 and built on, but instead, they received 2.5 million. And I think it was 2017, and now they're back at the legislature trying to get the rest of that money that they were shorted out of.
Man, I think that's related to your experience that you write about at the beginning of the book. When you talk about Alabama A&M and then the University of Alabama Huntsville. The University of Alabama Huntsville was, correct me if I'm wrong, was like 50 years old or something like that.
Yes.
And then,
I was 60 years old when I got to A&M. Yeah.
Like, My mom is older than the college. You know what I'm saying? Like, and yet and still, Alabama A&M, Alabama State don't have comparable sort of facilities, funding that the University of Alabama Huntsville has. And one of the things that stood out to me in the book, because I always wondered, like, why is it that they have these universities that are relatively new that are doing better than like my HBCU that's been around since the 1800s?
Yeah.
And I never had an answer for that. And so that's one of the things that I appreciate about what you wrote in the book, because it's not just a history, it's a timeline. Like, it takes you from what happened back then and it brings you all the way into what's happening today. And so I'm wondering, like, I want to think about what's happening today, and then also like what's happening, what you see maybe are some solutions for the future. So can you speak about like the renaissance, or what maybe not even be a renaissance of philanthropy at historically Black colleges and universities, and how that may or may not be enough? And then we'll get into talking about like what you see some of the solutions being.
Yeah, so it's 2020 by any really by any measure was a landmark year for giving, philanthropic giving to HBCUs, where you have like Mackenzie Scott donated, literally just herself gave several institutions the largest single donation that they had ever received in their institutional histories. But of course, that was unevenly applied. Alabama A&M did not receive such a donation. It actually just received its largest ever single donation just this past week. And so it was $2.2 million. But, the thing that I always caution with thinking that about philanthropy and these sort of large gifts, is that there's a sort of ebb and flow to philanthropy, especially at HBCUs. Because if going back to the founding of HBCUs, some were founded by state entities. A lot were founded by wealthy Northern philanthropists, white philanthropists, or church associations. The American Missionary Association played a large role in the establishment of several HBCUs. Several, the African Methodist Episcopal Church established several, and in the late 1800s, you had this contraction where that energy around giving to HBCUs waned, and the institutions, they really faced that repercussion. Right, when the wealthy individuals decided, okay, actually, this isn't serving me as much as I thought it was anymore. I'm going to back out, and so. I absolutely applaud it, but I also think that it's not a sort of substitute. It shouldn't be a substitute. It should be a both and, with sustainable resources from both state and federal sources for public institutions, but also for the private institutions, it's really a matter of they're sort of building their endowments to a place where they are financially sustainable and viable into the future, and so. And there are a couple of markers of institutions that will struggle, and it's like fewer than 1,000 students, fewer than an endowment that's smaller than $50 million, located in a rural or impoverished area. And a lot of, private HBCUs fall into those categories. And so it's really, beefing up their reserves so that they're able to weather storms in the same way that a lot of that some private, predominantly white institutions are. But, going forward, right? So this year alone, thanks to some of the stimulus packages, and the COVID relief packages, HBCUs will get about 3 times the amount of funding from the federal government that they would get in a traditional year. So across about 15 programs, HBCUs get about $1 billion a year from the federal government. This year, they're going to get about $3 billion. And I think one of the first steps is to make that funding recurring. That funding should be something that the HBCUs can rely on to continue performing the work that they perform. I think that there's also a lot on the campaign trail, because I covered education and national politics at the Atlantic, so I was able to cover the campaign last year. On the campaign trail, a lot of the candidates were talking about their free tuition or tuition-free models for higher education. And at the end of all of that, a lot of them started wrapping HBCUs, both public and private, into their free tuition and debt-free college models. And I think that that work is important as well, because if you're looking at a state like North Carolina, where 25% of Black students who attend college in North Carolina do so at one of the 5 public HBCU, or who attend public colleges in North Carolina, do so at one of the 5 HBCUs. And then I think it's 52% of the Black students who attend college in North Carolina do so at one of the community colleges. And I think it's jumped like 22% do so at the predominantly white institutions. And there are 12 predominantly white institutions. And they're serving a smaller population than these 5 historically Black colleges. And so I think the more that we can sort of understand the role that these institutions continue to play, and the more that lawmakers put their money behind that important role, rather than just talking about, oh, HBCUs are important and they've historically important institutions. Like, yes, they're historically important, but they're also currently important. They are also still playing a vital role for Black people and Black community. And so I think that making that funding recurring, also states owning up to their responsibility to Black education where they have shorted it before, is important. And I also think it's important for the federal government to actively, start to take a look again at what states are doing and whether or not they're fulfilling their obligations under federal law.
Yeah, thank you for that. So those of you who are in the audience, there is a Q&A function, and you may use the Q&A function to type questions, or it's going to be harder for me to use the chat. So I'm going to ask that you use the Q&A function. You type your question in there, and then what I may do is I may ask you to unmute so that you can ask your question out loud if you want to. And then if not, I'll just read it off the chat. Okay, so if you all have questions that you want to ask Adam, you may type it in the Q&A chat now, not the normal chat, but the Q&A function. And then we'll start directing questions to him. And so to give you all some time to do that, Adam, I'm going to ask you a quick question. If no one has questions, we'll just continue our conversation. Yeah. There was a point that you made earlier that I didn't connect, or I never thought about before. And it was when the states would take money that should have been allocated to the historically Black colleges to send Black students to Northern PWIs that had the graduate schools or the professional schools to get their education. And I was like, that hit me. And it hit me because that's the money for us that should be going into our institutions from us, because we're going to our own institutions, but it's getting siphoned off and going into a predominantly white institution that is allowing the student to come in there. But it's not like they had to pay, the graduate assistantship or for the PhD. You want to come here for free? It's not hurting us. That's like interest convergence. And so I've been wrestling with this notion for like 2 or 3 years now. And that the current state of, and I'm not saying you said this, and I'm not saying you said this in the book, so I don't get you in trouble, but I feel like the current state of diversity and inclusion in higher education as it pertains to race is in a lot of ways like a reverse reparations for predominantly white institutions. Because, I benefited from it because all my graduate school was paid for and it was all at white schools. So I get that, but it doesn't make sense to me that I bet if you were to do some more research, you would find that there are African-American studies programs, right, at predominantly white institutions that have higher budgets than entire HBCUs and teach less Black students. And so I wrestle with that, right? I know that we integration in terms of the equity that it can produce, that's the narrative that we've been sort of told, but some days I'm like, listen, we need to stop diversity and inclusion at PWIs and just give the money to the Black colleges, because they don't do a good job of it anyway. So it's like, why are we giving them money for something that they've never proven to do good at? So I just want your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I am often, I think one of the issues that I have sometimes with diversity initiatives at some institutions is whether or not that commitment to, like, whether it goes beyond simply saying that, well, oh, we have a diversity, equity, inclusion initiative now, and we're trying to build a more inclusive culture, whether it goes beyond just saying that to actual resources for the community is actually enrolling students, right? They're like, you know, in the same way that in jobs, like, oh, we have a diversity, equity, inclusion initiative, but we still don't hire Black people, but we still don't hire, you know, brown people. You know, we're still kind of pulling from the same select student body of people, or the same kind of crop of individuals. Or for example, you know, several banks over the last year have really said, hey, you know, we want more. We want to launch this diversity, equity, inclusion initiative. We want to help the community. But as soon as the Biden administration said, hey, we have a $4 billion program to help out Black farmers because they've been discriminated against by both banks and the federal government, the banks wrote a letter to the Department of Agriculture and said, wait, if you pay off that, we're going to lose money. And so, like, was the initiative, it's like, did it help you see the role that you play in discrimination, or was it just kind of a, okay, we've checked the box? And so that's the thing that I end up sort of wrestling with is, are these institutions actually committed to that work, or are they just sort of checking a box? And the way I'll loop that back to higher ed is, you know, several institutions over the last several years have done these sort of investigations into their relationships to slavery, into their relationships to segregation and Jim Crow. And, you know, they may rename a building, they may take down a statue, you know, they'll issue a formal apology. And that's not to say that, you know, renaming buildings and taking down statues isn't important, because those monuments matter, and how, you know, you remember and reconcile with history matters in a deep way. But, you know, is there room for the institutions such as Ole Miss, which was keeping Black students out when Alcorn State was being stripped of funding by the state? Do they have a responsibility to aid the historically Black college with some of that money that they were making when they were keeping Black students out? And, you know, a lot of institutions met down in Mississippi a couple of years ago to have sort of start the beginning of that conversation. But I think there needs to be a conversation about, you know, the money that your institution has been able to make. Georgetown, for instance, sold 272 people to keep its institution afloat. Does it have a responsibility not only to help those people, but also to you know, advance Black education beyond its own walls? So if a place like Auburn, which has, you know, 5% Black students, if they said, you know, we have this diversity, equity, inclusion initiative, what does that mean in terms of how you are helping the institutions that are enrolling more Black students, not only in percentage, but also in sheer number than you are? So yeah, I think that's an important question. And you know, as you know, HBCUs are able, you know, if HBCUs are able to receive that funding, so they're able to enhance their graduate programs, they're able to grow into R1 institutions. Or you have to think about the fact that these institutions were discriminated against for so long. North Carolina A&T discriminated against for so long, and is still able to have such a robust offering of graduate programs. So imagine what they would have been able to do if they were not discriminated against, if they did receive the matching funding for all of those years. Like Tennessee State, the state of Tennessee just said that they've owed Tennessee State between $150 million and $500 million over a 50-year period, just from like one or two programs that they were shorting them funding from. So what would that institution be today if it were able to receive that funding that the University of Tennessee did, that Middle Tennessee State University did? And I think the more that we start to ask those questions, and the more both lawmakers and administrators at predominantly white institutions really grapple deeply with what retribution for their legacies actually is, I think, you know, the more we have those conversations, the better off we will be in the long.
Yeah. So we don't have any questions in the chat, so I'm just going to throw some ideas at you just to kind of get your response. So I was thinking about how do we get more money to historically Black colleges? I was thinking to myself, I was like, you know, what's his name? Roy Williams was the head basketball coach at UNC. He just retired. I'm like, why don't we just tax athletics?
Hmm.
And I mean, I just look at it like, so let's say an administrator, a middle tier administrator at UNC probably makes $200,000 a year. So I would say everyone in athletics that makes over $200,000 a year, every dollar after that $200,000 gets taxed by the state in half and goes to the Black colleges. You know, like, because sports,
Yeah.
that's why people at A&T used to wear Chapel Hill. I would be okay with students at A&T wearing Chapel Hill stuff if
there was
that,
money.
you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, that is, I mean, I actually hadn't thought of that one, but I mean, for a place like, you know, for a college football coach, say, who's making like, you know, $3 million or $2 million or however much it is, that would actually move a significant chunk of money to HBCUs. I think also, if you're thinking about how in state university systems, sometimes the way that endowments are pooled, and maybe there's a sort of endowment share between those predominantly white institutions that have been able to build up those reserves, particularly for the unrestricted bequests. Because yeah, like for endowments, there are a lot of places where, you know, it's restricted. It's like, you can only use this money for X thing, or you can only use it for X thing. But there are a lot of unrestricted bequests at these institutions that they've been able to build over time. So perhaps there's a way that that can be shared with the HBCUs. You know, I think I may have made this point about Mississippi, right? But they made that settlement with the state that was, you know, 17 years, $500 million between 3 colleges, where the University of Mississippi can make $500 million in 5 years of private donations. And so, you know, thinking about, you know, how to level the playing field of philanthropic giving alongside leveling the playing field of funding to the institutions from the state is an incredibly important conversation to have. And it's always difficult to know the way that philanthropy is going to flow when we are currently in a moment where you know, philanthropy is really targeted towards HBCUs. But if you're looking, you know, the Chronicle of Philanthropy has a database of, you know, the top gifts to, you know, all sectors, but you can break it down into colleges and universities. And even though you had that last year where there were these massive gifts, this year, if you look at the top 100 gifts to colleges and universities, I think there are 2 HBCUs that are in that top 100 for gifts above $5 million. And so, you know, that 1 year doesn't absolve or doesn't sort of fix that historical discrimination. And I think if HBCUs are able to and philanthropists are willing to sort of continue that giving. That's the thing. It's like, it can't just be that one-time injection. It has to continue in the same way that it is continued for PWIs, right? Michael Bloomberg gave something like $1.2 billion in one donation to Johns Hopkins. Think about what that would do. You know, even if you were doing $50 million donations to each HBCU, what would that $1.2 billion do for these institutions? That sort of transformational gift. What would that do for the institutions? So ensuring that those philanthropy dollars aren't just one-time things, if they're recurring, but then also looking for, you know, innovative ways to sort of level the playing field in the state in terms of equity.
I think about the solutions that you point out in the book. As you can tell, like, I'm all into like HBCU stuff. So I remember watching the documentary on PBS, Tell Them We Are Rising.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a part in the documentary, I think it was Yale. And Yale, they were going to build an HBCU in somewhere in the New England states. Mm-hmm. Yale was like, we're not having it.
Yeah.
We're not, they literally shut down an institution before it could even exist. And so I think about some of the data coming from the University of California system, right? The amount of Black students that they have in their university system-wide is just abysmal, right? But it's a West Coast school. The HBCU thing really didn't make it to the West Coast like that. And I'm wondering, as part of this repair, as I've heard you say before, is it in addition to looking at the historically Black colleges that we have now and ensuring that they have equitable funding and support, but is it also a possible solution, or what do you think about a possible solution just to build more Black colleges? To look at, like, think about the history of the institutions that have made moves against us and hold them accountable by asking them to build really good institutions?
Yeah, I think it might be difficult now. I mean, it was of course politically difficult then. That was when, William Lloyd Garrison and all of them in 1831 are like, they're in New Haven and they're saying, hey, we would like to establish this college that is not far away from Yale. And yeah, they did. They had a town hall meeting, and basically like 3 days later, they were like, actually, no, we're not going to do that. But I think, if you look at a state like California, it's like you have institutions. So there's like a difference between, historically Black college and like predominantly Black institutions. So like Chicago State, for example, was, it's a predominantly Black institution. I think, since you have these institutions already in place with large shares of Black students, I think some of this comes down to actually funding the institutions where Black students are enrolling. So if that's the community colleges, it's funding the community colleges so that they have a path towards, the four-year institutions that you should also be funding in a way that is equitable. So several states have moved towards these like performance-based funding models. And, some of them have equity in mind and others do not, where, that the sort of legacy is propulsive. So an institution that has momentum, like the University of Kentucky, both in terms of like overall enrollment, in terms of the funding that it has, so that it's able to provide robust supports for students so that they're able to be successful. And that means that they have like higher graduation rates and different things like that. They're rewarded with more funding because they have higher graduation rates, because they have more students. In an institution which may need more funding in order to provide those robust supports for students, may be docked or dinged for funding because their graduation rate may be a little bit lower. I think that those funding models should be construed equitably reimagined, so that the institutions that serve large shares of Black and Brown and minoritized populations are actually being funded in an equal way. That institutions that enroll large shares of low-income students, that is being taken into account when you are thinking about the ways that you are funding these institutions, not just the institutions with momentum, but the institutions that serve marginalized populations. And I think one of the last things there is that in that construction, so where they're actually funding these institutions, we see this broad divide now where it's like this enhanced stratification. So where it's like not outright segregation, it is stratification, so that the institutions with the most wealth, with the most resources, enroll the fewest Black students. And it's almost a one-to-one. You can kind of go down the list of the institutions with more Black students typically have less dollars, to where you have this sort of $5 billion gap at this point between funding for Black students and white students. And so I think if we move towards that sort of equitable redistribution of state finances on a budget, on a budget line, one-to-one, year over year, I think that, there may not be the need for new Black colleges, but I think that would actually encourage institutions to fulfill these sort of higher ideals that they profess to, right? Higher education loves to talk about, the higher like Enlightenment ideals and what it provides for society. But this would actually, when you kind of attach dollars to that, that's when they start to own up to that legacy that they're that they often try to forget about.
I want to ask this next question in two parts. The first being, what would it look like for historically Black colleges and universities to have this book be part of like a freshman orientation or a freshman curriculum and things like that? So in addition to your book, maybe how would you like to see that presented at a HBCU so that the students can get context for where they're learning? But then also, if you were building out like a class, if you go back to Alabama A&M and teach a class about the state must provide, in addition to this book, what other books, what other sort of sources would you include in that curriculum?
Yeah. So one of the first, I think I have it over here somewhere. I don't see it, but it's Shelter in the Time of Storm by Jelani Favors, who actually, I think, just came over to North Carolina A&T. But it's a fantastic book. It's really it digs into the sort of second curriculum that HBCU students have historically been able to receive from the faculty in terms of how to navigate a world that is not, that is set up for them to fail, how to actually, navigate their place in America. Another one would be The Origins for Federal Support in Higher Education by Roger L. Williams, which really digs into how the federal government became involved in higher ed, how higher education institutions that receive funding from the federal government are supposed to be supported and have historically been supported. I think that the book ends up being in conversation with one of the books that I really leaned on in this, really for that early Reconstruction period, was W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction. I think that's a book that also ends up factoring into the conversation. Reparations and Reconciliation by where's that one? So Reparation and Reconciliation by Christy Smith. Sorry, there's a light on it. The Rise and Fall of Integrated Higher Education is another one that it actually digs into. One of the institutions that is actually a character throughout the entire book is actually not an HBCU, and it's Berea College. Yeah. And Berea was the first integrated coeducational college in the South, founded in 1855 by a Presbyterian minister. And I think this book really gets into the ways that the state has a sort of intentionality in breaking up such institutions. And not only that, but it talks about philanthropists and their commitment to HBCUs and Black education and how that waned, whether it was the American Missionary Association or others. So I think that those books, I think that was those four books alongside The State Must Provide kind of form the outlines, but then there are dissertations. Catherine Weedle has a fantastic dissertation about the Second Morrill Act and the conversation that was happening around the Second Morrill Act. So I think that they're between a mix of those dissertations and papers alongside those books would really, if I was building out a course for students to understand the ways that the institutions have historically been underfunded, but also the ways that they have enriched students. Because I think one of the things that I was actually so interested in with Dr. Favors' book was how they enrich their student populations. And I did a story a couple of years ago about North Carolina A&T and the day that the National Guard came to campus at A&T, and I talked to Jelani about that and talked to him about the activism on the campus at A&T and how that environment fostered activist energy and people who were pushing for civil rights. And it's really so it's like to understand the institutions and their totality. We talked at the very beginning about the beauty of attending an HBCU and how it's a singular experience because of the ways that the faculty pours into you, because of the way that your fellow students interact with each other. And then it's just like, you have a lot of fun. You have the parties and things as well, but the intellectual experience alongside that sort of nurturing environment is a remarkable experience.
I want to say, still thinking about students, let's say we're going younger than college students. How would you have these conversations with children in K through 12? And I think it would be a great recruitment tool, just in general, just to give them some context for where they may be going later on in life. But how would you see this being integrated in K through 12?
Yeah, I think by focusing on there are points in the book where I talk about the work that HBCUs, several points in the book where I talk about the work that HBCUs did in terms of educating Black folks when other places wouldn't, and that they still do in educating Black people when other places won't. And also how, you know, for a lot of people, it's like HBCUs aren't just like, this isn't my fallback institution. This is an institution that I actively wanted to go to. And I think that a lot of that is attached to the legacy of these institutions and the important work that they did, to the alumni base, not only the old alumni base, but the current alumni base, right? I think I might have mentioned Mandela Barnes was at Alabama A&M not long before I was at Alabama A&M, and is now a lieutenant governor in Wisconsin. So like Vice President Kamala Harris, you know, coming from Howard. So it's like, it's not just like the select HBCUs that are, you know, producing you know, talented alumni that are educating a robust student body, but it's all of these HBCUs. So I think if you know, students in K through 12 learned more about the legacy of these institutions and knew more about them, I think that they would be, you know, that would encourage them to want to take a second look at the institution and ultimately attend.
And I'm just surprised. Sometimes I meet young people in our community and they don't even know what Black colleges are. Like, you know, it's like, they're missing a whole thing. Even if you decide not to go, the fact that you don't know what it is, you missing out on an opportunity to go to a homecoming, right? On a college tour, or to go see a battle of the bands or anything like that, right? You may know the names of some of the institutions, but you may have no context for knowing that that institution is a historically Black college and that is meaningful. So want to get to the one question that we have in the Q&A, and that is, are you aware of anyone who is leading at the federal level supporting reparations for historically Black colleges, or maybe just more broadly, like just support for HBCUs in terms of policy and things like that, if not outright reparations?
Yeah, so the co-chair of the bipartisan HBCU caucus in Congress is Alma Adams, Representative Alma Adams from North Carolina. And she has really been a force in terms of, you know, presenting legislation to help the institutions. You know, Senator Cory Booker has also been really adamant about, you know, supporting the institutions. As far as, you know, anything that sort of looks like reparations for the institutions, there's not, you know, something that's approaching, you know, the level of support that would, you know, start that sort of reparations conversation. But I think that it is an important one to begin to have. So it's like, it's not only additional partnerships with, you know, federal government institutions, but it is also, I think that there's space for the federal government to acknowledge its role. As Heather McGee puts it, right, public policy created the racial inequities that we recognize today, and only public policy will fix it. So I think it's important for more lawmakers like Representative Adams. I know that you know, Senator Doug Jones, actually, when he was still, former Senator Doug Jones, when he was still on Capitol Hill, he was a, you know, major proponent of HBCUs, of course, because there's so many in Alabama. Representative Terry Sewell is also, you know, doing a lot for the HBCUs in the state. So, and, you know, I also think there is a significant role, even beyond the federal level. There's several lawmakers in Pennsylvania actually now that are fighting for enhanced resources for their HBCUs. And they've had to stave off several times pushes to close their HBCUs. And interestingly enough, Pennsylvania is one of the several states that has not proven to the federal government that it's desegregated its higher education institutions because of how it's treated Cheney University, how it's treated Lincoln University. And so I think the more state lawmakers like those in Pennsylvania, the more federal lawmakers like Representative Alma Adams continue to push and you know, make people realize that this isn't just past discrimination, that this discrimination is ongoing and it needs to be addressed. I think the better the HBCUs will be.
Yeah. There's one more question in the Q&A. Have there been attempts or any form of support from financial investment institutions that are predominantly African-American owned? So Harlem Capital, other venture capital firms, private equity, angel investors, what have you?
Yeah, I think private equity has started to get involved with HBCUs. I mean, it really kind of, that private equity's involvement actually kind of started with Robert Smith's investment at Morehouse. And so that's been very recent though. And I think that there is a role for kind of private investment and angel investors to play in funding for HBCUs. But again, I think my biggest caution there is that, outside funding is fantastic and is necessary. But I am seeing as state and federal actors crafted the environment that allowed this discrimination to flourish, as well as took part explicitly in the discrimination, right? We have like Amos Hall, a lawyer for Ada Louise Simple Fisher, saying that, it's not our fault that you created this separate and unequal system. And, if it's expensive, that's not our problem. It's your job to fix it. And so I think, I put a lot of the onus on state and federal lawmakers to begin to address that inequity. And if, venture capital is able to help out in that, then it'll be significant. But there has been, in recent years, a sort of growing interest from, smaller venture capital firms and some Black-owned venture capital firms to start to address some of that inequity.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we're getting close to the end of the interview, and I want to say, Adam, thank you for joining us here today. I appreciate that you wrote the book. I view this book as a form of philanthropy. There have been people who have said that the fact that Black folk are still choosing to go to HBCUs in and of itself is a form of philanthropy. Like you wearing your Alabama A&M shirt is a form of philanthropy. And I'm gonna go ahead and say, look, somebody's gonna put this on Mackenzie Scott's desk, and y'all gonna get y'all 40 million too. It may not happen in 2021. It's by 2023, y'all can get y'all 40 million. That's what I'm gonna guess. But really, thank you for joining us. I appreciate you for sharing your experience and sharing about the book.